can access it and understand it and make sense of it.
Yeah. Which is insanely hard to do. When we actually, if it makes you feel better for how hard that was, when we did the workshop over the summer, I had a journalist tell me to shut up because I kept talking and talking and thinking I was a calm person. I thought clearly I would be better than other people, and I'm not. So it's insanely hard.
It is, but it isn't. We'll give you some tools, some preliminary tools. So here are the goals for today. The first goal is to really help you create a clearer, more concise message about your research. We're going to start with research, not with something else. You can apply this to teaching, service, to any of the other things you do, but really about research. And second, to practice delivering your message. We're probably not going to get too far into that today. We could follow up, or you guys can follow up with yourself, amongst yourselves, or as we say on Long Island, talk amongst yourselves. And we're really, I think, and this is the thing where I would fault the Allen Alder group, is they actually, not the Allen Alder group, the NSF, I felt less confident after that, and I'm actually pretty comfortable communicating. We'd like you to feel more confident about communicating. I met with a guy on campus who looks like someone who should be on camera, who's really articulate, and he said to me, I am petrified of being interviewed. I turn down interviews because I don't know what to say. And I said, well, what do you do to prepare? He says, well, I just write out every word so that I can memorize it. And it's like, well, that's the opposite. We want to instill confidence in you that you know the work that you do. You know it so well. You don't have to have the answer to everything. So let's help you gain a little confidence with a particular technique that we'll teach today. All right, here's a clip from Allen Alder just to give you. How many of you are old enough to remember that sound? All right, we're just going to play a couple of minutes of this so you get a sense of.
Can you hear it? Everybody hear it, okay?
Oh my God, I love improv. Can you imagine doing that with him? Okay, he does improv workshops with scientists to help them learn how to communicate complex concepts in a more understandable way.
Never mind. Okay, so that is a great idea. We want to go there, but let's first talk about this week. Alan Artis passed away.
Yeah,
Obviously,
I was very sorry to see that.
yeah, but worked with you on MASH.
Yeah, and a wonderful guy, and so believable in his character.
We had trouble clipping those, so you can.
Yeah, we tried
him on the show. I'd sit with him between shots, and I'd ask him questions about psychiatric theory.
He was great.
Everybody
Okay.
did the show.
So let's talk about what you're doing at Stony Brook University. It's fascinating. You know, I was a lawyer, and actually we did some some defense work for doctors. And we say, hey, idiots, 90% of your problem is a communication problem. And from the very beginning, you would sit there and tell your patients what's going on, why it's happening, and explain it to them. They would, you build a
And I've
relationship.
heard from several members of Congress that they cannot understand scientists when they come to present their work to them and look for funding. Why would you give money to somebody whose work you don't understand? Doesn't make sense.
So what do you
So what we do, we normally work on, improvisation is an innovative way to help them relate to the people they're talking to. And so that gets a lot of attention because it's innovative. But we also teach writing and all forms of writing. And what we're trying to do is make it clear and vivid, not dumb it down, not make it oversimplified, but make it so that you, for instance, we started a contest called the Flame Challenge, where scientists around the world were invited to explain what a flame was so an 11-year-old could understand it.
Right.
And thousands of kids around the world, all over, like from Australia, all kinds of places, judged the scientists' entries.
How great is that?
And it brought the scientists up to face what it's like to be simple but accurate.
Okay.
So that's really what this is about, is being clear and straightforward, but also accurate. No one is ever asking you to dumb down your data, to represent things that you don't stand behind, but to find a way to package what you do so that it's accessible to other people.
And we'll do a quick improv extras with you if we have time at the end.
And again, if not, we can come back and do, this space is probably not great for the improv stuff. By the way, I'm working on getting the Allen Alder group here. They're coming for this Blue Sky Faculty Fellows group, but I'm going to try and bring them back next fall to do a larger training with Allen Alder. So, yeah, keep your eyes peeled. So I want to step back and just talk a little bit about a theory that people tend to use in communication. And you might use this in psychology as well. I can imagine that there's people who study framing theory. Do social psychologists do that?
Sounds familiar.
So framing theory is really a way to understand the context in which data or evidence appears, to put it in a frame, right? Are you approaching this from an economic angle, from an interpersonal angle? How are you framing your information for the other person to be able to access it? So what it does is it works with interpretive schemas and storylines. It's about putting what you communicate into a kind of story that will be accessible to other people. People hear story and they get a little nervous. We'll play around with this. It's about sense making. So if you have a frame that you can keep coming back to, especially with complex ideas, there's a whole science of communicating complexity that I know the world of psychology has contributed to as much as communication in other fields. It's often used, and Theo would know this, as a journalistic device, right? What's the frame you're going to take on a particular story? So for example, one of my students, Holly Smith, who you know quite well, she studied the frames used to talk about renewable energy in Maine. What do you suspect the key frame has been since 1995 in the Portland Press Herald? Economic frame, over and over and over again. Science frame doesn't show up very much. So there's a real opportunity there to increase the scientific frame, probably through the economic frame, right? How do you get those to talk to each other? Frames are really helpful for taking complex information and simplifying them. The trick is to do it in such a way that you don't lose sight of the important things you want to convey, so that you don't undermine the complexity, but rather communicate it clearly.
And I find it helpful to remember framing theory in terms of just an actual picture frame. If you imagine you're looking at a giant landscape and you hold up a frame next to your face, what part of your research do you need to highlight? And what part is going to make the most sense given your audience?
Or through what lens are you looking at it? What's the perspective that you're taking on it? So that's an important question to ask yourself if you're sitting down with relatives at the Thanksgiving table. Who are they? What's their situation? And how can you frame this in such a way that it will be more accessible to them?
So Laura's going to walk you through an example of how she does this with her own work.
So I came up with this idea for a project. And this project is to build a group of leaders on campus, faculty leaders who can talk more and collaborate more effectively with the legislature. Because we identified there was a need to fill this gap. They really didn't understand what we were doing. So I came up with this idea. The president said, okay, we'll put money behind that, and suddenly I have more work than I ever signed up for, and she's studying the group. We're going to use this.
Wait a minute. There's no money behind that.
Oh, there's money.
In terms of the effects on the faculty, the offer, the incentive is lacking.
Yes,
in
I
that
understand that.
initiative.
That's okay. Let's not get into that too much right now. I understand that.
No, I'm
worry.
just doing the psychology,
Yes.
right? So
No.
psychology
I'm
is-
talking
oh,
about, for me, actually, we got a really robust number of people to sign up. There's 20
Oh, that's
people.
good.
Yeah, no. People were very excited because they know they're going to get this Alan Alda training.
Money in terms of running the program.
Yeah, money in
Yeah.
terms of running the program. So I'm just very passionate about this work and want to see it happen. So this has been supported, and I'm just going to use it as an example. You want to click to the next one? So, and it's based, like we said, in part on the Alan Alda training, but also on this Compass training. I don't know how many of you, gosh, I'm just blanking on her name, the Mitchell Center lecture. Do you remember her name? We read her in the class.
I know.
I can't think of her name. Jane Lubchenco's work at Compass, and on the congressional communication model. So there's a number of models that this training is based on. All right, so here's what I want you guys to remember, and we're going to give you a handout of this, and you're going to practice this. This is a device that I find incredibly helpful, because what it does is it helps you break down what you want to say into very simple terms that you can almost kind of imagine on the inside of your forehead if you were to close your eyes. Let me ask you this. If you were to get called right now by a reporter, how would you feel? They want to talk to you about religion and social psychology. What would you go through emotionally?
There would be some anxiety.
Yeah. Probably
Yeah.
some excitement too,
Yeah,
that your
yeah.
work's getting out there.
Yeah.
How many people would feel a mix of anxiety and excitement? So you know what the first thing you do is when a reporter contacts you? You say, let me get back to you in 5 minutes. And you hang up the phone and you do one of these. Now, reporters, probably one of the extreme situations. More often than not, you might be preparing to talk to a group. You can use the same device. This is just one of many techniques. I find it useful because it is so simple. And the idea is to make it simple so you can depend on it. All right. So what happens in this model is, just go back to it for 1 sec, Brianne. The way that it works is, you want to think about your main message, and I'm going to use the Blue Sky Faculty Fellows as an example here and walk you through it. My main message, you'll see this in a minute, is something I ingrain in my head, so no matter what happens in the conversation, I know that I can come back to that touchstone. It gives me a sense of faith and trust. Did you see Alan Alda talk about the flame challenge? He knew he wanted to do that. He had something akin to a message triangle. He wanted to communicate what they're doing with that flame challenge. He slid that in there. If you go back and watch that, I've watched it like 4 or 5 times, they didn't ask him about that. That was in his message triangle somewhere. One of these points. You could go out and dissect the whole thing, right? But he wanted to bring that up. He got to help steer and control that conversation by knowing he wanted to bring that up. So then what happens is, you're going to have a background of what is the problem? All right, so here's the problem with my Blue Sky Faculty Fellows. Not that this is the ultimate project. It's just a good example that I feel confident talking about. Key stakeholders, like Maine's legislators, have a very poor understanding of what we deliver to the state. That's the problem. We actually have tons of data on this. And if I can remember this point, you can say, well, Laura, well, what don't they know about us? And I can say, well, they don't understand what we deliver in terms of research. They confuse research and development with teaching. I know all that detail. If I don't have this touchstone in my head of what the key problem is, I'm going to get lost in that data, trying to memorize all of it. So it becomes a kind of, you must have good terms for this in psychology, you can help me with a
heuristic, right?
A kind of, or trigger point that lets me organize and sort all of the details within it. All right, so I've got boiled down my problem. The next one, part of your triangle, number 2, is the progress. What progress have you made? Well, we implemented this Blue Sky Faculty Fellows program that's based on the Alan Alda Science Communication Training Model. Again, I have a ton of details and data I could supply, but I know that I feel really safe with those 2 things. I can remember them. I can see them in my head. If I'm on the phone or I'm looking at my triangle as I'm talking, and I can depend on that to help steer my information and bring it back to the frame. And the third one is, what are the solutions? And what they recommend is that you have a maximum of 3 things. And that you even think about signposts or parallel language. So I might have, our work is helping UMaine identify strategies for communicating and collaborating more effectively. It's helping faculty to gain more confidence. And it's helping to build new infrastructure at the University of Maine to also reach out to graduate students and undergrads. I can remember those 3 things and come back to them. All right, then my key message is the Blue Sky Faculty Fellows Program will help align UMaine's efforts with Maine's needs. So do you get a general idea of how this works? Now, if I'm talking to a different group, I'm probably going to have to sit down and do a different message triangle. I was kind of imagining being interviewed by the BDN on why this program is important. So you always want to do some audience analysis if you know you're getting interviewed, if you're giving a talk. And then you can step back, you can practice this, you can have someone interview you. You would never give this information always in this order. What it is it's an opportunity, it's like a kind of meditative moment where you can come back and say, let me come back to the problem. And you saw Alan Alda do that with the flame challenge without being prompted to do it. He wanted to make sure that that came out. He wanted to make sure to talk about it's not about dumbing down. I'll bet that was somewhere in his schema before he walked in. I want to make sure to make that point. I want to make sure to make the point about we use improv to help people communicate more directly and clearly. So what we're going to do at this point is have Brianne walk you through some key tips, and I can chime in too, some key tips to think about if you use this message triangle. Try it out with each other. What are some of the kind of confidence builders that you should think about as you prepare to give a talk or be interviewed or go on camera?
So first and foremost is so what? We talked about that a little bit. And from experience, I can tell you that the so what for an academic audience is very, very different from the so what for a non-academic audience. For example, you would not stand in front of the legislature and try to explain things in the same way that you would explain it to your professor, right? You're not going to defend your proposal in the same way.
I'll tell you, when we did the Alan Alda training and every other training that I've done or seen, this is the hardest piece. Because, I mean, if I just look at you, why is your research important? It's going to depend on who's asking. It's going to depend on who's asking, right? If I'm your mom, or if I'm, a kindergarten kid, your answer's gonna be really different than if Shannon asks you, or I don't know who your advisor is. Because I can publish it here, or because we can help inform the way people make decisions about, I don't know, X, Y, or Z. Right?
So next is your audience. It's not always the case that you're going to be able to do an in-depth analysis of who your audience is, but thinking about them once you get, I would actually think of the audience first. Those should be switched. But so think about who your audience is and what they care about, and then frame your so what for that particular audience.
We actually have a sheet we could follow up with that helps you think about your audience and what they want and need. So in the case of this Blue Sky Faculty Fellows group, we have extensive data on the legislature. We know they don't want to talk to our administrators, they want to talk to faculty, they want it face-to-face, and they want it verbal. They don't want to read your multiple regression analysis, as sexy as you might think that is. They don't have time.
It is sexy. Totally
But
agree.
they don't have time. They don't want things quantitatively, they want categorical information. That stuff helps, because then you think about how you shape your message to align with their needs. If your point is to communicate with them, what is it they want and how should we deliver it to them?
And that might mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so what if you don't know your audience? What's the best route?
You can proxy. So give me an example of an audience you might talk to.
So I was thinking about like when you're at a conference and you're doing a poster, and you're halfway through a conversation with someone, but all of a sudden someone new walks up. And you want to get across your point to everybody all at once,
Yeah.
but you have no idea what they study or why they're coming to your poster. Should you dumb it down a little, or maybe not dumb it down, but frame it in a different way?
Maybe, I think when you're giving a poster, you have an opportunity to ask. So if you're giving a
Yeah.
poster, you're at a conference,
Yeah.
right? So you could assume the person's there, maybe it's APA. So you could say, what kind of psychology do you do? Do you study social psychology? So you could ask.
Right.
Or you could assume, because they're there and they're coming up to you, they understand some. You can also, and this is where the improv training is so great, you can study people's body language and react to that. If we have time, we'll do an exercise at the end.
That's
but-
the fun part.
Yeah. So it really depends on the scale. Like if you're going on the Katie Couric show, which Amy Blackstone did, you would want to, you can even look at the ratings, the Nelson ratings, the ratings and see who's watching that show, who tends to watch that show, what do they care about, what's their political persuasion, what's their religion, how old do they tend to be. I mean, advertisers know all this. If you're going on TV, you can figure that out.
Usually the producers have to know all that.
Right.
You can ask
beforehand.
them.
In terms of media, for sure.
Yeah.
You can ask.
Yeah.
And it might mean, when considering your audience, it might mean that you don't get to talk about your favorite part of the project,
Yes.
and you have to have a frame around another part, and that's okay, because it's about your audience caring about what you do.
What's nice about the message triangle is you get to sit back and think about, what do I really want to get across? I mean, for me, the Blue Sky Faculty Fellows is University of Maine cares and we help the state. Right? I want to always be able to come back to that point. We matter for the state.
And another very important point is to keep it simple. This is very difficult to do, to try to explain your work without using jargon, for example. I kind of want to challenge a couple of you to talk about your work not using the word cognitive, maybe, for those of you
Just to
that
try
do
it.
cognitive work. And this does not mean that you're dumbing down your work. We really want to drive that home for you. It's not about making your work less complex or less important. It's about making it more accessible. And be creative. Think outside the box. I think a lot of times scientists were trained to communicate in a very backwards way. If you think about like journal articles, they're written with all the background first, and then findings, then implications, then limitations, right? So why your work doesn't actually contribute that much. And in terms of communicating with the public outside of academia, you want to flip that around and get to the main point first. And that can be really difficult to do. But it's all about being creative and trying to think outside of how you've been trained to communicate your work and thinking outside of that.
One thing I'll add here that a lot of people ask is they ask, because we work with confidence levels as scientists and social scientists, right? We never can say exactly, here's what you should do. We understand that there's uncertainty in decisions. How do you communicate that? There's some really nice techniques that you can use, and one of them is you can say, professionally, I can't give you a direct answer to that, but personally, here's what I would advise. So that you can separate yourself. You can do that in an interview. You can say, based on everything I know as a human being, here's what I would advise we do. The science tells us this, and it brings us this far. Here's what I would advise. So you don't have to, I mean, think about the debates around climate change and just how that got blown out of control, and scientists then felt attacked in their work. There's some really nice techniques. There's a wonderful book called Escape from the Ivory Tower by Nancy Barron, who runs the Compass training, and there's a whole section on dealing with uncertainty in there. That's part of how you can be creative in communicating what you do and not feel like you're betraying the scientific merit of your work.
Tell a story. There's a lot of research that people remember stories and that stories make sense to them. I can tell you at the Alan Alda training that was, 7 or 8 months ago, the one thing I remember about the talk that he gave for 45 minutes were the 2 stories he told.
Yeah.
It's extremely important. Alan Alda says they're very sticky. They stick in people's minds. So if you can get them to associate you with a story, it's really helpful. Restrain, reduce, and emphasize. As much as us academics love graphs and love showing data and all the data we've collected and all the work we've done and showing all the sexy analyses that we've run, you really need to restrain from doing that and emphasize simple things that are easy to remember. For example, this graph, very forgettable. 71% is a lot more memorable.
Have you had that experience? You've been at a talk and you see people's eyes start to glaze over, like, oh no, they're not following you from one piece to another. People don't hear the same way that they read. People can read in a very different fashion. They can take a break, they can come back, they can reread. When you're communicating verbally, do you know how many times you have to see an advertisement or hear an advertisement generally to remember it? 3 times. You need 3 exposures before it sticks with you. And that's with a simple ad that's built on a brand that's already established. So how intensely would you have to be listening to follow? So the rule here is try to avoid your slides and graphs unless you want to make a key point, and then really bring that point home.
Practice. This is really, really important. I actually have designated non-academic friends that I call and say, okay, if I said this to you, does this make sense? I'll email them papers and say, does this abstract make sense to you, coming from outside of my discipline? And there's a really great quote by Mark Twain: if you want me to give you a 2-hour presentation, I'm ready today. If you want me only to give a 5-minute speech, it will take me 2 weeks to prepare. So practice giving that elevator speech. You're familiar with that term. So if you only had 3 minutes to talk to somebody, what would you do? The message triangle helps a lot with that. But practice doing that.
And if I might say, you might find yourself in that situation more frequently than you think you will. Encountering somebody, this has happened to me so many times in being in Maine, encountering somebody who has a connection at a church that I might be able to collect data at and going, okay, I need you. How do I tell you about what I do
I can't tell you I need
enough?
you, but that's
yeah,
weird.
exactly. I can't
Yeah.
say, wait, I need your connection. I mean, it happens. It may not be for money. It may be for access to a population or for something else. But
Breathe. It's very important. It's a very peaceful picture of someone breathing. I think it's really important to remember too, something that's helped me a lot is the statement that you know your work better than everybody else. And the people you're talking to are going to know very minimal about what you do, and you know so much about it. So take a breath and find comfort in that. Find comfort that you already know the information. It's not about memorizing. It's about framing. An adorable picture again. And try to relax. I'm sure a lot of you have given speeches or watched someone give speeches who they're really nervous. And it's so distracting when people are tense and shaky. And so it really helps your message to come home for people if you're calm and you're conversational.
One of the things I really, really love about this Alan Alda school is that the whole premise is built on this idea that we suffer from the curse of knowledge. We know so much, we can't step back and understand what it's not like to know what we know. So Alan Alda advocates for this concept of audience empathy. Rather than, it's not about delivering the perfectly packaged message, it's about taking into consideration, it's not about you, it's about us. It's about how we interact in such a way that you and I can share something about what I'm doing and what you need to get out of it. And I feel what that does is that takes the pressure off you to perform the perfect role and puts more emphasis on the relationship. And honestly, that's much more consistent with communication theory as constitutive, as communication constitutes our relationship rather than I'm going to take this message and convey it in a perfect way that you'll understand. That's not how communication works. We don't transfer one-to-one. It doesn't arrive exactly as I hoped. So I think it takes the pressure off you and it lets you relax and think about, what kind of metaphors do I need? What kind of animation in my voice? What kind of slides would help me convey this information so you can share something I've learned and I can learn back from you? So it takes that pressure off, which I think is really key.
And finally, and relatedly, smile. And it kind of goes along with the storytelling idea that it's sticky. A good personality is also very sticky, and a bad one's very sticky. So you really want to put your best foot forward just in terms of relationship and in terms of conversation. And a smile goes a really long way. If you're friendly, people can forgive a lot more than if you're not. Not that we've ever had experience communicating with jerks, right? Nobody ever experiences that.
Okay.
So, to help you
I'm
work
gonna have
through
you
this,
try this out.
we have a communication triangle worksheet for you, and it'll be helpful because then you can take it. So you have two. What?
So what is my
I don't know what goes in the middle.
Well, we're
work
going
on
to give
that.
you something to work on. We thought we would take the pressure off you to pick something out, and
So-
we picked out some abstracts.
Right,
for
so
that
you
department.
can do your own research if you'd like. I would recommend you start with someone else's. These are abstracts from psychology professors in this department. There are 5 of them. Feel free to pick whichever one you find most compelling. And what we want you to do is read the abstract and use the message triangle worksheet to help you suss out what that means and why that research is important.
You could do this 2 ways. You could pick one abstract and try to communicate about it, or you could take a couple and talk about what the psychology department at the University of Maine does. I would encourage you to envision a BDN reporter interviewing you for the purposes of this exercise. All right, maybe they want to know what's up at the psychology department at the University of Maine. What are you guys doing here that
But
matters?
if you were doing the New York Times, you would do a completely different approach.
It
wouldn't you?
depends. It depends on which section you'd be into.
So would you guys prefer
But
to do it
in
in
terms of level, right?
Yeah.
would you
So
prefer
BDN would be not the typical level for a psych group, right?
I think imagine what the
More of
BD,
a-
I'm just asking you to pick an audience,
Yeah,
just
okay.
for the purposes of an exercise. So what would the BDN want to know? They'd want to know how the University of Maine is delivering back to the state. What are you guys doing that matters for the local community?
If
That's
you'd-
good enough for the purposes of this exercise.
If you prefer to do it in groups, feel free to get in
Yeah,
groups. of
please work
3 or
in
4.
groups.
It's a lot. It's easier to do it when you're working with
And
groups.
you guys, this gets easier the more you do it. It's a little challenging the first time. Just try to come up with a key statement and think about what supporting evidence on those 3 parts of the triangle you could use. Just give it a try.
Oh my god, this is so dense. That's so funny.
I smiled when I was copying and pasting.
Look at our
I know.
But those abstracts, right, are very appropriate. They were published. They're very appropriate for academic audiences.
Increased survey activity predicted enhanced performance on an information integration task. Anyone?
Sorry, Sean.
That's right.
Sean,
I have one there
Shannon.
too.
Shannon, you got a couple in here. Marie, you got one.
But there are like, I guess I would wonder how the neuroscience group would line up here. Is Sean, are you in here? Yeah?
Yeah.
So
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
if Alan had an animal study, or you had, you know, Sean, the lab that does the animal studies in some sense has a part of problem, because if humans are involved, you right away have a story. But when animals are involved, you know, people are pretty sarcastic about what the implications of the work are. So I think like some of the students, how many students have an animal model? Oh, it's just you, Walter? Max? It's a
You know what?
challenge.
Just give it a try. This is just an exercise. You don't have to do this for real yet. We're deliberately giving you something that's not yours, just to give it a try.
And it's much, much easier to identify jargon and words that would
Yes.
confuse you if you're reading someone else's work. So hopefully this is helpful. Except for you, Shannon, you're kind of stuck. But
So let's do one. Let's get it done.
we probably just need one abstract. I wanted to get options.
Just give it a try.
You already done. Yours is just as good.
It's really bad. It looks bad.
That's part of the plan.
I think so.
They're not bad though. I don't want you to read
No, I
these
know. I
as
saw
bad,
that. It's
but
just they're so jargony.
a very
This
specific
is
audience.
the challenge.
Yeah.
There's a different
I was
way
just
of writing
imagining my
it.
grandmother reading that, and
Yeah.
nope. I know those words. What they mean together.
They did a really neat exercise with us at the Alan Alda School where they made us explain a situation in baseball without you to someone who had never seen baseball before. So it was like the ninth inning, the bases are
It
loaded,
was a sports
the
page.
team's up to bat, there's 2 strikes. How do you explain that to someone who doesn't know what bases, loaded, innings? And there was a guy who did it. It was beautiful.
After many failed attempts.
Yeah.
And we actually had someone from the Philippines who'd never seen a baseball game. And so she was
Yep.
Right.
That's fair. I think they're both pretty hard to see.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is
Mm-hmm.
cognitive. Right now you're very aware of that word.
Yes.
There was a
You can also explain the word and then use it. Actually,
and if you get stuck
can
and you
do
feel like
that.
you have to use it, you can, and then we can help you work through what we might use instead.
you know, can I recommend start with the so what? What's the so what? And it doesn't mean that any one of these abstracts solves the world's problems like on bilingual children and education, but the so what could be the University of Maine. This person at the University of Maine is helping us to understand how children learn depending on what their language ability is when they come into school. That, you can remember that. How are they doing it? What's the problem?
Taking out the combative defining. Because when I was first exposed to it, it was like, you're the ninja or whatever.
Shannon went through that, too. You went through that.
The ninja.
It was just so close.
I heard it was horrible. And I got the even preparation materials to.
So maybe take about 5 more minutes to work through this. Please feel free to talk out loud, work in groups. It's totally okay. You don't have to be
really,
quiet.
work with each other.
I think I'm going.
Use whatever resources are available to you.
You can also use a synonym finder. I use that a lot.
Traumatic brain injury.
Although that's becoming more and more common in the news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Football.
Wait, traumatic brain
That's
injury?
what we
Yeah.
were looking
TBI.
at.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
been a lot of coverage
Concussions
because of
and stuff.
football. And
Yeah.
That's the other thing is what works one year, the next year might be different.
Yeah, no, you could just say.
It's very dynamic.
Yeah, brain injury.
It's like
Yeah, it really does. It really should be message based, not
Right? That should be the
message.
take home point
Yes.
of
Yeah.
the
That was recent this year, right?
Yeah.
I don't do that.
Last.
I don't know.
I just think when I read this too, this is supposed to be what other people, like non-communication people feel when they read my abstracts, like, oh, right? Who wants to read that?
I think this exercise is good for interdisciplinarity too.
Oh, yeah.
Just
Oh,
because
yeah.
it does, because you make all these assumptions about what
I'm
a
trying
term
to
means.
find a way to.
I'm trying to
Like
get
survey?
NFL.
I listened to
I think my record speaks for itself.
an ecologist talk about surveying frogs, and it took me 10 minutes of him talking about that to go, how are you giving frogs pens and paper? Like, I was like, what is happening to the frogs? How are you surveying them? And then-
SES is
Social ecological
ecological
systems, and
systems.
social economic status.
Yeah, you're right,
Yes,
SES.
SES. So for about the first 3 or 4 all-team meetings, I was completely lost. It was like,
Yeah, yeah, and acronyms, yeah. That's a whole other.
Make a great average.
All right, 3 more minutes.
This is just an exercise.
Yeah.
Any of those would have been nice, right? Like, why didn't,
Why didn't I say that?
right?
We have time to do this all day.
Well, this last one has a bunch of acronyms. MVD, SAD, CTL.
You can see how much passive voice there is in here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sad. See, I always thought it was seasonal affective disorder. I guess it's both.
I think it's seasonal affective passive. I think it has 2 Ds.
Oh, you're right. You are right.
Yes.
So at the workshop, they had us take an abstract and turn it into a play. We had to act,
We had to act it out.
Freaking hilarious. Wasn't
Oh,
that
okay.
good?
Did you squawk like a chicken? Was that your group, the chickens? That's good.
I don't think
That
it's
would be
opera.
great. Yeah, it wouldn't have to be a musical.
It's like the dance of your dissertation.
You've seen
Yeah, I don't think it says it.
Did you see the one with the sword in
Direct.
the air?
Yeah, pretty, yeah.
Oh my god.
Oh, no, I did see that. Yes, it's
Oh my
amazing.
god, and the woman and the egg thing, walking on water and all the guys
doesn't even say
swimming.
It's really great.
What do you mean? Yeah.
I don't.
Just take our word for it. Just measure.
That's
Oh, yeah.
Okay, ready to bring it back? It's okay if you're not ready. You don't have to have it done. So, what are some of the techniques that you used to translate the jargony mess into a triangle? The beautiful jargony mess. Have respect for jargon. But
Yeah, this is not about not using jargon. This is about figuring out appropriate language for different contexts. I really dislike when people say, you shouldn't use jargon. Scientists, social scientists need jargon. It's how we communicate. So that we can take a term like SES and you can use that, and in your world, you walk around and say SES, people know what it means.
yeah.
Yeah.
So even when you try to do that, or try to keep using jargon, I've come to the point where some people they feel like I'm talking down to them,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not at all. And they're like, I could just see it on the, the expression
Yeah.
on their face,
Mm-hmm.
and then I start dumbing it down, and then they think I'm insulting them. And then
Mm-hmm.
so that's like a big problem with if you use some jargon, then they think you're talking down to them, and then
Yep.
if you dumb it down, then they think you're like almost insulting them.
A similar problem too is if you use too much jargon, it's the same problem. You sound like a pretentious, inaccessible jerk.
Yeah.
But if you
Well,
don't, especially in front of the legislature, for example, they don't think you're credible because your
Yeah.
work sounds so simplistic that they're like, why do you get paid to do what you do? And I think the improv and the relational connection helps address that. So even if the content of your message might be a little bit too jargony or not jargony enough, if you can establish the smiling and the connecting with someone and use, too bad we don't have a million hours to do this, or we totally do improv, but use human-to-human connection techniques to kind of buffer that effect.
The other thing is to think about using your story to set it up in the beginning. Metaphors are incredibly powerful. Like if you think about the climate change communication around shifting baselines, how effective that's been, that people can relate to this visual, and then you can go in and say, and in my field we use this term called, you may be familiar with it, so that you're giving people credit that they might know it, but you start off with something relatable.
So what are some of the techniques that you used to try to academize?
Yeah. How did you
Abstract.
approach this? What was your process, Theo?
Well, I'm not familiar with it. Coming from a different
Yeah,
discipline.
that's all right.
And so I went through and I underlined what I thought was like the key terms,
Yeah.
and then tried to translate just that key term and figure out.
Yeah.
That's really good. Did anybody else go through and underline the really important, what you felt were the important parts? So what else did you do? There are no right or wrong answers. It's really just a personal technique to help you.
I mean, definitely we use a lot of like kind of cold passive language, which can really add a million more words to a sentence that isn't necessarily needed. So really just like completely crossing out some of that passive language can help. We're really uncomfortable with the word, this makes this happen, but that might be appropriate in a given context. If you're trying to say that something is causal or, yeah.
One of the things we learn to do is a kind of mix of these techniques, and it is to step back and say, all right, we've got this data communicated in this terse way that it needs to be communicated in to be an abstract. So other people in your field can read through it quickly and say, oh, this is how they did this is what they learned. But if you step back and you start with the so what, that so-called inverted triangle, where you deliver the punchline first. What did they learn? What did they learn? And then putting it into a story. What did they do first? What was the problem? So there's a problem. What's the problem? Or the gap? What did they do? And what did they learn? And then thinking potentially about a metaphor that you could use to communicate that. Does anybody feel like you came up with something for the middle of a triangle? I would just love to hear a couple, if you came up with something, just to share an example. The idea here was not to make you do a message triangle that you're going to get interviewed on, but just walk through the process with something that's not yours, so you can see what it feels like to do this. It's even harder when it's your own. Anybody come up with something they think worked on one of these?
Or any corner of the triangle?
The problem for me was that it seemed like with your example of your core message, you had a clear audience that was identified for your core message. Whereas I feel like in this exercise, I didn't really have an audience other than just anyone who was interested in this work. So
Okay.
that's where the sticking point for me was I couldn't, say, oh, we're important for, to Maine because we fill in these gaps and help these people communicate. And,
Right.
I didn't feel like I had that audience that I could identify and tell them why this is important and why they should be interested.
Yeah, we probably should have been a little bit more clear that you just picked any audience that would have, sorry to not be more clear about that.
So if it is a BDN reporter coming to ask you, just
I don't even know what that is.
Look at that!
I'm writing and going, this is way too long.
I just went into acronym.
See, acronyms. Actually, this is a very important point. Acronyms,
Bangor
stay
Daily News.
away from acronyms.
Yeah, Bangor Daily News. I apologize.
I mean, I'm an out-of-town graduate student,
Yes.
so,
Did anybody get a core message? Come on, somebody.
Can I give Jordan's a shot?
Yes.
Please.
He's trying to
I'm trying
show
to.
you how big.
So, I wrote, this is about the role of religious messages in creating negative attitudes towards people outside that religion. Is that basically what you're trying to say in this abstract?
Broad brushstrokes.
Yeah.
In very non-technical
Yeah.
But we can put a happy spin on it, right? You'll,
Okay, this is
you'll
good.
like people better if they're in your group.
So Jordan, what was it like for you to
Jordan,
hear
yeah.
hear your work framed in that way? You kind of cringed a little.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't because it was. It's hard to get at the nuance, to get at the sort of subtle parts of the message in such a short. That's what I've been trying to do, and my triangle is too small.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's certainly
triangle's
not
too
that my
small.
message is too big. No, but yeah, I think that's yeah.
So how would you I actually think it's really helpful to have someone else do this for you first, because then you can modify it. But if it starts to get too complex, you're not
Yeah.
going to be able to communicate it.
Yeah.
So what would you do?
Because
if
so it's
Theo
not the message.
I was trying to
Right,
figure out how
yeah.
to, and I kept wanting to put it into communication terms,
Yeah.
and I was trying to figure out how not to do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could we say, I mean,
Because it's subliminal priming
Yeah.
is the key thing.
for
right?
me, the key thing is that religion can contribute to
Right.
prejudice.
Yeah.
Like it's nice that it makes you also like other religious people.
Right.
But
It's the ugly derogation.
but this ironic effect of a religion that's supposed to make you more compassionate, whatever, actually makes you derogate other people.
So something even as simple as we think that religion makes us more open and caring, but really it may make us more intolerant. That's a pretty simple and clear, you could see how a reporter could translate that into a headline. And you've been able to control this message, and then you can qualify it in the interview and think about, well, what are those key things that I need to be able to say so someone doesn't just run rampant?
Yeah.
Let me just say this, and Theo, you can confirm this coming from most journalists want to help you. They don't want to nail you, they don't want to back you into a corner. They want to help you get your message out.
They also want their jobs to be easier, so if you come to them with something really great and like soundbite ready, like they love that.
Yeah.
And I know it can be really hard. The reason when I saw you cringe, I resonated with that. It can be really hard when you hear someone else explain your work in a way that you don't feel like is complete. And when you use a framing technique, it's not going to be complete.
Yeah.
You're getting a tiny snapshot of a giant picture. And getting comfortable with that is a process. And I would highly recommend you talk to your friends and have them repeat back what you do, just so you can get used to other people framing it in the way that makes sense to them. It can be very painful, and I know as scientists, we really want to be technical and concise and correct. And there was a woman who was working on isolating proteins, I remember because she kept using the word proteins, isolating proteins that will contribute to how we treat breast cancer. And the journalist in the training kept repeating, so you're curing cancer. And she was terrified that he would report that she is curing cancer. And he said, but broadly, you are contributing to a body of work that's going to cure cancer. And it can be so hard for us to frame our work in those broad ways. See, everyone's cringing, like, oh, I don't want to cure cancer, I'm not curing cancer. But to make your message relatable, you need to frame it in those broad terms. Yes.
Can I give an example too? When I was working as a production assistant with a health reporter briefly, I had to listen through interviews of doctors and scientists trying to explain like things like cancer. And you would listen to half an hour of a person talking to find like that 5-second where it actually made sense. But in that, that person doesn't have control because we're listening, everything doesn't make sense to the viewer, what we're picking out. But if you come with something that's like, okay, that makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense, then they're not going to throw away as much. Like I remember one interview, it was just so much jargon, we didn't use the interview at all. It was just, okay, we can't use that.
And that's the last thing you want for your work to just be cast aside. And it's not because of the quality of the work, it's because of the way it's communicated. So,
Actually,
sorry.
I hate to disagree with you, but
by all
wouldn't it
means.
be worse for someone to have your work put out there in a way that is not accurate?
Yes.
Or would be...
Yes, oh, for sure. I did
Like,
not mean
I
to
am curing
imply,
cancer
sorry.
even though I'm
Yeah,
not
I didn't
curing
mean to
cancer.
imply, yeah.
I think that would be much
It's better
worse
to not be,
than
yeah.
my voice not being heard at all.
Absolutely.
I
So that's why you have to
absolutely agree.
understand
Here's what I think. I think not everybody has to become public. All right? You get to make the choice of whether you want to do that or not. I think more of us do need to get public, and we need to get comfortable with talking in a different way about what we do. Because there's a lot at stake for people understanding the value that scientists and social scientists contribute to the world, and we have a hard time doing that because of how we're trained. So that doesn't mean all of you need to. I would never encourage anyone to put out information you feel inaccurate about.
Yeah.
This is just a 1 hour, very short workshop to give you a sense of what this is and why it's important. If I were working with you, I would work with you until you felt really good about your triangle. And we did it over and over again. We recorded it and you felt all right. This is not about you saying something you don't feel you can stand behind. It's about getting to a story where you feel like I'm confident, and if a reporter calls me or if I need to go speak to a bunch of 6th graders, I can confidently say, you know what, no, my work, I'm not going to cure cancer, but I sure hope the work that I do can contribute to people who are doing that. And then maybe that's a message you feel safe and good about, but it's not about you being uncomfortable, it's about you feeling like you have some control over your message and can get it out in however you choose to do that, whether you want to blog. You get to choose that. Do you want to run a blog?
Yeah.
Do you want to go on TV?
Okay.
You don't have to do that.
You can say no to all those things.
You can say no to all those things. But I think ritually, if in higher ed we don't start to take a stand and think about these things, and I'm just really thrilled that you decided to do this, because a lot of programs, we run surveys on the groups that we work with, meaning questionnaires, you fill them out, and we asked of a recent group, what are you most interested in doing workshops on? This is a $6 million joint project between UMaine and UNH, focused on beach and shellfish problems, right, due to bacterial pathogens, very technical. Do you want biophysical science workshops? Do you want social science? What do they want? They want workshops like this. And then we ask them, why are you committed to this project? It's not because of the money, it's because they want the work to matter. And when we ask them, where have you gotten information in the past? I've done it on my own. So part of our effort is really to do research on these processes, but bring work that helps people to communicate their work better. It's not going to be perfect. You're going to feel a little uncomfortable. And this is a kind of simplifying technique that we hope will help some. This has to grow in increments. You're not just going to go out there and do this all at once. But I personally, and I think Brianna would agree, I would push myself a little on this, because I think we're in a lot of trouble at universities if we don't get a little bit better about showing that what we do actually matters. So I know our time is technically up. I hope both of us help. This is helpful. We'd be happy to come back and do some improv work with you, because what that does then is that helps you feel more relaxed. You get your message triangle. If we do that, I'd have you do a message triangle about your research personally, and then we can come back in and practice the improv techniques and then try to interview you and see how that goes. Yeah. It takes a little bit more time. This is something that deserves probably 20% of your time at some point.
And we have tip sheets on how, interview tips on communicating in print media. Some of the stuff we covered, some of the stuff we didn't, but we thought it'd be helpful for you to take home.
Yeah. There's a lot of great information out there. I really, really encourage you to get Nancy Barron's book. It's a fantastic book with the whole training program built around it.
Maybe I can get electronic versions of that stuff, and I'll push
Yeah,
it Prezi
sure,
and just make all that available to everybody afterwards.
So, yeah, we have time for questions. I just didn't want to hold you past your time, so go ahead.
So I've heard things like we should frame things at a 6th grade reading level or something like that. Is there any evidence that backs that up, the sort of reading level, you know?
Theo, you can probably help with this a little bit in terms of really like Katie Couric show, Today's Show. New York Times definitely not. You'd be writing a little bit more. I think it really depends on your audience.
Medium too.
Yeah.
Like print is very different than broadcast, because if you're talking in broadcast, you want to talk in a way that people are going to remember, and it's going to be conversational, which is very different than what you're doing in print.
Yeah.
But I think as a general guideline, is it 6th grade, 8th grade?
I feel like that's kind of this general like common sense mythology that's out there.
I don't know where that comes from.
Yeah, I don't know where it comes from either. But the thing is is it something you would just say in a normal conversation with someone on the street? And
yeah.
they would
There's also no such thing as the general public. That's such a fallacy. So it kind of goes hand in hand with that. There's many, many different audiences, and you know, depending on where you're going. And I think your point about audiences, it's well taken. This is a 1-hour workshop. We can't get into too much detail, but you would want to try and understand, but not to the point where it demobilizes you from taking action. I think in many ways a good story will communicate across different audiences. And one thing I'd encourage you to do is look at some really great TED Talks and think about what those people are doing. These scientists and social scientists, I say scientists in the broadest sense, okay, who are out there communicating what they do, they've gotten training, most of them. They're not just getting up there and doing that. They've worked with people over and over and over again. They've seen themselves on camera. They've been interviewed. Maybe they've blogged. They've talked to very different kinds of audiences. They've gotten feedback and they've honed their message. I mean, I remember I had an aha moment at the Alan Alda Science Training. You'll love this because you study interdisciplinarity too. But they're like, how would you explain why it's, like, what it is to study interdisciplinary teams? And I came up with this thing, and it was like, well, I work in the ivory tower of Babel. And people were like, wow, I get it. Ivory Tower of Babel. Now, the religious thing can get a little complicated. It's a little synthesis of what it means to study people who do very different things within an institution. People understand universities and ivory tower. It can take a long time before you get to that. So if you run or meditate or whatever you do in your free time, that's a really good time to be creative and think about, is there a cool metaphor I could use to describe my work that would synthesize for any range of audiences, and then I could tailor the level of detail that I give appropriate to that group. Yeah.
Oh, along with what you're saying, I just started teaching a biological psychology class, and I have students that are psychology students that want to do psychology to avoid biology. And so you get them in a class and you're trying to describe some kind of neuroscience thing and you'll get the glazed over look. And every once in a while, I'll struggle enough with something and I'll come up with a good metaphor. And you can instantly see that it makes sense for the students. So yeah, having a good metaphor or some kind of visual thing or some other way of describing something always is a good way to go.
You bring up an excellent point, and that is you can try these techniques out in teaching. Teaching's just another form of communication. This is all about tailoring to your audience so that you're feeling empathy with them and bringing the message across so they can walk away and remember the impact of what you do.
To practice.
Practice in your class. Try out different things and
Captive
see what
audience.
happens. And ask them, did that work? Did that work?
So was this helpful?
Yes.
Very nice.
If you have further questions or even want us to run by an abstract, we're happy to do it.
I have one last question. So there was, I know we joked about regression being sexy.
I was
there was a point where there was a graph up there, and the suggestion was to avoid graphs and figures.
Too many.
Too many.
If you're going to use a graph or figure, really make it matter and say, you know, I've just talked to you about, I'm going to make something up, how important it is to understand sleep and age, and that there's this particular magical age when if kids don't sleep, they're going to turn into jerks.
Right.
Now let me show you what that means in terms of the numbers.
Right.
But you want them to have the point, not get lost in the
Right.
data.
And I would use
Before
it
they even see the
sparingly
numbers.
and make
Before
sure
they
they
even see
really
it, they should know what.
Right.
and that it reinforces the message you already have, not that it stands by itself.
Right.
Just one point that I experienced a lot and had a lot of experience with this in the last 2 years. And the one thing that really was shocking to me was that the journalist often comes to you with their story already, and they just want to scientifically validate it. So they lead you in a direction that is not where you want to go. And if you say anything that confirms, you know, even as they prod and prod and prod, and I remember one time I said something like, yeah, the incidence has gone crazy. It ended up in the NIH library. And the director of the library took this particular interview, I think it was, with the New York Times, and wrote, Marie Hayes, University of Maine, says, quote, this has gone crazy, unquote. That's it. That's it. And that was the wrong, the humiliation for me as a scientist is this is exactly the kind of chat that I never make off the cuff.
I don't want to ever give you the impression that we're saying you shouldn't be careful. You should
have
be
to be
very
really,
thoughtful.
really
But
careful.
remember, when journalists come to you, they have a deadline. They work in a different world, their culture is different. And I think the message triangle can help you to make sure you know what you want to say. This is your like superhero armor that you're going in with. It's your protection. It's your touchstones. You can be clear. This, I am not willing to say this, and you can say it in a friendly manner and say, what I hear you saying is this. Here's what I want to emphasize. Right? That's the middle of your triangle. Do you want to comment on this,
I was
Thea?
just gonna say, like, from what I was saying earlier, like, this person who has a long thing of jargon that gives the journalist more opportunity to do that, so they can
Yes.
pick and choose, whereas if you have a very simple, concise message and just repeat that.